Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We are delighted that you are joining us for this webinar on Restorative Justice Pedagogy. This event is jointly convened by the Education for Justice Initiative at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and the Law Department at Maynooth University in Ireland. This is the third in a series of 3 webinars that we have hosted on this topic, and we have approached this on a sort of cross-regional basis to allow for real-time discussion. We have aimed to keep the webinars quite intimate in setting so that we could have a sharing circle so that academics can share on their practice in teaching restorative justice. So today we are joined by more than 25 academics from Europe, Africa and the Middle East. We had previously held roundtables for the Asia Pacific region and another for the Americas. So this series of 3 will be available as recordings that we will link to the resources that we have designed in the Education for Justice initiative. So I'll talk more about that initiative in just a moment. But first, I would like to introduce the colleagues that are co-convening this webinar with me. We are very fortunate that Dr. Ian Marder from the Law School at Maynooth University has taken the lead on bringing us together. And indeed, Ian will take the lead in facilitating the sharing circle, the substantive discussion about restorative justice pedagogy. We are also joined by my colleague from UNODC, Jamie Lee, and Jamie is the substantive lead on restorative justice within the justice section at UNODC. So in a moment, I'll introduce Jamie to speak further on our work in that regard. A couple of colleagues from UNODC are also sitting in, and so thank you very much to Bianca and Ruta for joining us today as well. And before I give the floor to Ian and Jamie, I would like to provide some background on the Education for Justice initiative at UNODC and why it is that we at the UN are working in higher education and in collaboration with academics in the first place. So I will share my screen with you. This just takes a moment. Take quite a few clicks, but that's up there now, Ian?
Yep, all good.
Great. So allow me to introduce, to some of you anyway, I know that there are some participants in this webinar that are very familiar with our work in the Education for Justice initiative, but this is an opportunity for us to further share with academics the work that we are doing in the higher education space. And this has occurred as part of the global program for the implementation of the Doha Declaration. So let's wind back momentarily to how this all started, which was at the close of the 13th Crime Congress in 2015 in Qatar, where the Doha Declaration was adopted. And this was a unique moment where on the global stage there was attention to the issues of crime prevention, quality education, the promotion of the rule of law, and the role that these things play in the realization of the Sustainable Development Agenda. So in 2016, with funding from the state of Qatar, UNODC embarked on an ambitious global program to implement the global agreements that were made in the Doha Declaration. And so this is the global program that you can see there. And you can see that there are 4 pillars: education for justice, which I'll talk about more, but also judicial integrity, youth crime prevention through sports, and prisoner rehabilitation. These 3 pillars I won't speak about in detail, but I would encourage you to look at our website because there's information there that I'm sure would be of interest to you. They really are cognate to the work of restorative justice. But Education for Justice is what brings us together today, so let me delve into that in a little more detail. The intention with this initiative, which operates at the primary, secondary and tertiary levels of education, is to provide educators across those three levels with quality materials that will allow them to teach on issues that support the rule of law, that support an understanding about the implementation of measures that uphold human rights. I work primarily at the tertiary level, and this is why we're working with tertiary educators, for example, in this webinar. And at the tertiary level, we have designed a comprehensive range of modules across a broad range of topics. You can see across the top there are 9 topics: ethics and integrity, anti-corruption, crime prevention and criminal justice. And this is the series that I have been most closely involved with, and it's in this series that we have our work on restorative justice. We have a module series on organised crime, trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants, firearms, cybercrime, wildlife, forest and fisheries crime, and counter-terrorism. And within each of these 9 core areas, we have a series of modules, approximately 14 in each of these, and they are freely available on our website, and they are designed for academics to make use of those in their teaching. At UNODC, we are not prescriptive about how they are used. We encourage academics to look at them and pick and choose whichever aspects work best for their teaching practice. It may be that there are case studies in there that are interesting for you, or there may be exercises that you think would work well with your students. The core reading list might be of interest. But we've also designed them in such a way that they provide academics that aren't already expert on these topics with an introduction to the issue. We look at the key literature, we look at the key debates, we explain the key terminology. We provide PowerPoint presentations that academics could use or adapt in their teaching. So with this initiative, we're aiming to broaden and strengthen the teaching on these topics globally. They have been developed by academics in partnership with us. So the approach that we have taken is very much a partnerships one. We have not done this on our own. We have been involved with many academics around the world, and we continue to be. And this is both through the development of the modules, the testing of those modules in teaching, but also through validation meetings where academics sit and scrutinise the modules. They have been independently peer reviewed. And we are also in a process of continuous improvement with the modules. So our plan is to, for example, through hosting events like this, we gather additional materials that we can embed within these modules. So they are, in fact, living documents that are linked to the issues and the challenges that are emergent. So 9 thematic areas, and they are flexible to use. They are multidisciplinary, both in the way that they have been designed, but we also hope in their appeal. So for example, the crime prevention and criminal justice series, we have designed this in a way that we hope that it is not interesting only to criminologists or only to legal academics, but we really want this to be interesting to sociologists, to gender studies scholars, political science, across disciplines. And you can see on the right there broadly the structure of each module. So just a reminder that these are all available on our website. If you have a look at UNODC E4J, you will find the tertiary component where these 9 thematic areas are all listed. This provides you with an indication of the modules that are in the crime prevention and criminal justice series. So you will see there that module 8 is dedicated to restorative justice. So if you're not already familiar with this resource, you may like to have a look at that after our session. It might be something that is of interest to you in your teaching, but it might also be something that you would like to share with your colleagues to further promote teaching on restorative justice. I just want to quickly identify that within this series there are a number of other modules that may be of interest to academics that teach on restorative justice. So for example, Module 11, Justice for Victims, Modules 12 and 13, Violence Against Children and Justice for Children, and Module 10, Gender in the Criminal Justice System, and 9, Violence Against Women. Of course, the very live question with respect to restorative justice and whether it can be used in terms of responding to interpersonal crime and gender-based violence. This is something that we touch on very briefly in the restorative justice module. But there are certainly cross-cutting fields of interest there. I think that perhaps also Module 7, Alternatives to Imprisonment. In the time that I have, it's not possible for me to delve into too much detail about those. But before I hand the floor to my colleagues, I would like to just indicate that after this session, I will be in touch by email to explain further ways in which we could stay in touch. So the Education for Justice initiative, I have already said, has been very collaborative. We have worked very closely in partnership with academics, and we very much welcome the opportunity to continue to work with academics to strengthen our work and ensure that the materials that we are delivering are useful to academics. And within this, we also have some opportunities for collaboration and so on. So I will send you an email with some links where you can indicate whether you would like to perhaps join our network, for example, and I look forward to being in touch with you after this meeting. But back to the business at hand today. Thank you very much for joining us. I look forward very much to hearing from you about your practice in teaching restorative justice. From the 2 webinars that we have held previously, I fully anticipate that this will be a very stimulating session. The other 2 have run a little bit over time because there has just been so much enthusiasm to talk about these issues. So thank you very much for joining us. And please now allow me to give the floor to my colleague, Jamie, who will talk further about our work at UNODC on restorative justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, for giving me an opportunity to talk about our new handbook, and also to Ian for organizing this series of webinars on promoting restorative justice education. It's really nice to see so many friendly faces in the audience. I'm glad that you were able to participate in this important webinar series, and thank you also for your involvement in our thematic work on restorative justice. For those of you that I have not had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Jamie Lee. I'm a Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Officer in the Justice section of UNODC, where I focus on the use of restorative justice in criminal matters and also on alternatives to imprisonment. I just wanted to take a minute to say and share the exciting news that the 2nd edition of the Handbook on Restorative Justice Programs will be launched this Friday. The 1st edition of the handbook was published way back when, in 2006. And as you know, the field has gone through a remarkable amount of development and expansion in the past 16 years, yeah, and both in terms of use and geographical scope. So in light of this, the member states had requested UNODC to provide updated practical guidance on how to use restorative justice. And we have completed this endeavor through 2 rounds of expert consultations, which all began in 2006 from an Economic and Social Council resolution. And the draft updated version is now, has gone through revision and improvements and inputs from various member states and experts. Many of you are in the audience today. And now it is finally ready. And the new handbook is a new and improved version of the first one, in that it carries, it expounds upon a lot of the subject areas that were identified as having gone a lot of development since the first adoption of the basic principles in 2002, and they include a deeper look into the key concepts of restorative justice. They also, the new handbook also looks at the restorative justice responses to serious crime, which was not so common back in 2002. And now the new handbook also has a chapter on requirements for a successful restorative justice program, including how to safely and meaningfully engage victims, which was identified as a key area that should be provided guidance on. And there's also a segment on how to raise awareness and promote community engagement so that access to restorative justice programs are improved. These are some of the new subject areas, and I hope that you can join the webinar on Friday. The webinar would take place on Friday at 2 p.m. Central European Time. The link to register will be circulated later this week, and I will make sure that I share that with Ian so that it can all reach you. And I will also share a link to the webinar after my remarks. And also, I also wanted to take advantage of this great group of academics that we have at the moment to say that the handbook is available right now only in English, but we are constantly seeking ways to have it translated into as many languages as possible so that the readership could be increased as much as possible. So if you're in a position to make that happen, please contact me, and then we can explore ways to make that possible. Thank you so much, and I would have loved to stay and participate in the webinar as I have done for the past two, but unfortunately I have another meeting in a few minutes, so I will have to go. But thank you very much, and I hope that you can join us for the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Wendy and to Jamie from the UNODC and to Education for Justice for providing a platform for these important discussions. I'm a criminologist whose main areas of research and teaching are in restorative justice, so I'm very happy to be involved in this work. And as you probably know, academics often discuss their research on restorative justice, but less so as teaching. But this is a burgeoning area of scholarship, and so it's great that E4J include restorative justice among its modules and is collaborating to enable higher education professionals from around the world to discuss their teaching of restorative justice and restorative practices in universities. So the theme of today's roundtable is teaching restorative justice to the practitioners of the future. And we're going to focus on teaching restorative justice on university courses, the students from which will likely work for public institutions that provide human services. And I'm delighted to have registrations from many jurisdictions, including Austria, South Africa, Israel, England, Belgium, Poland, Spain, Scotland, Czech Republic, Ireland, Romania, Northern Ireland, Portugal, Turkey, Italy, Estonia, and Nigeria. Probably didn't need to go through all those, but nonetheless, it's very significant that that's the case, I would say. And equally significant is the fact that we have people from disciplines including education, criminology, law, public security, social work, and mediation. So I think we're bound to have a very interesting conversation ahead indeed. Firstly, I would say it's very important to note that we all teach students who will likely work in public and in human services, whether as teachers or lawyers, probation, police or prison officers, social workers, and so on. So the first question I'd like to open up to the whole group. And would anyone like to begin by telling us why they think it's important to teach restorative justice and restorative practices to their own students? Maybe someone who teaches lawyers, criminologists, teachers, social workers. Would anyone like to go first and just introduce yourself, introduce your area, and talk about a little why you think it would be important to teach restorative justice to that cohort? By show of hands or in the comments. Tally.
Yeah, hi. I saw, since nobody volunteered, I jumped in. Hi, everybody. My name is Tali Gal. I'm a law professor, actually, but in the criminology department in Israel at the University of Haifa. I'm actually now the head of the criminology department. And I teach restorative justice, and my students are a mix of people coming from education, law, criminology, different backgrounds. But we do have groups of either police personnel or sometimes prosecutors and defense attorneys working together. And what I've noticed is that no matter what the group is, from their backgrounds, restorative justice raises questions that are not only practical about how the encounters that are so volatile take place, but also very philosophical. And the course requires the students to ask the very basic questions. What are the goals of the criminal justice system? What is justice? What are the needs of victims, of perpetrators, of communities, of states? And these are the very basic questions that we usually take for granted. We accept the criminal justice principles, and we sometimes forget that there are other ideas. And restorative justice reminds the students constantly that things can be questionable and can be disputed and can be argued and can be changed according to context, the needs of the parties, etc.
Thank you, Tali. And you're from University of Haifa in Israel. That's right?
That's right.
Thank you so much. And Galma, you wanted to come in on that. You teach law students, if that's right.
Hi, Galma Akdeniz. I'm teaching at Istanbul Bilgi University, and I'm actually a criminologist teaching at a law school. And I teach restorative justice at our graduate program, master's level, and I have both law students as well as students who come from different backgrounds, and they're all in the human rights law program. So I think I find it very important, and I think they're very different groups, the people who come from law and people who come from other areas, and they're all in the human rights program, but they have very different approaches. And I find that law students tend to get very sort of black letter law education, and they tend to have a rather narrow point of view. My students, I mean, they're focusing on the retributive justice and on the deterrence and the punitiveness, and especially since they're in the human rights program, I personally think that they need to expand and think about different ways of thinking about justice, as Tali has just said, and how are different ways to seek justice, especially when it comes to human rights violations and what can be done about that. On the other hand, my students who come from other backgrounds, they're usually human rights activists. And I think they also benefit greatly from studying different way of talking about justice and thinking about active participation of parties in the process. And I think it's just important to expand their views and expand their thinking about what justice is and what it can be and what it could be. So that's my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Galma. And now to move to Sonia from Portugal.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sonia. I teach at the Faculty of Law of the University of Lisbon. I teach criminal law and criminal procedure law. And I also teach a restorative justice module on a course in a post-graduation course on another department of the University of Lisbon. And I'm actually teaching this restorative justice module as we speak, accordingly with the module 8 of the Education for Justice program. So I'm actually testing your module now. Well, from my experience, it's very important to have both a theoretical approach on restorative justice and a practical approach explaining the restorative practices, how they could be applied in very different contexts, because the group of students is very heterogeneous. I have this year I have people who have a background on criminology, on law, on social education, social services, even from the media. I have people with a very different background. I have people working in prison services. I have people working in schools. So it's quite different. So giving them the opportunity of coming across with a new theory of justice, who has actually several restorative practices that can be applied not only to overcome crime, but to overcome conflicts outside from the justice system. Usually it's viewed by the students as something new and something quite appealing that they want to apply in their daily jobs. And that's, in my eyes, a very positive point whenever I teach restorative justice, because usually I receive many months, even years later, some emails saying, oh, this restorative justice module was quite fantastic because I was able to apply it on my daily work. And that's, of course, our main conclusion. This is, students go away, but we give them something that they can actually use. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. And Vincenz, you teach teachers rather than lawyers or criminologists. You want to come in and tell us a little bit about that?
I like that because, I belong to a local association which works mostly with teachers in service training. But I think that it's imperative that we have restorative practices taught to just teachers doing basic training, because teaching is a lot about relationships, and my idea of restorative practices involves a lot of work on community building, not just on solving conflict. So I think that this part of community building and dealing with just everyday life, a conflict in schools, that's a must. So that's a struggle I'm having with universities here. I have taught a few workshops at universities, and I think that they should have like full courses on restorative practices.
Mm-hmm. And you are, just to say, you're from the University of the Balearic Islands in Spain, isn't that right?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And Petra from Czech Republic want to come in on that.
I wanted to add that we started with the RJ course for lawyers like 3 years ago, and it was the first course for lawyers in the whole country. And it's really like what we see, that after 20 years we have some experience with restorative justice. It's really missing in the law field. So the people who are mostly working with criminal justice are not educated in the restorative justice. So and the law students, for them it's normally just like one sentence in the textbooks of criminal law, and that's all what they got. So it's really like a new opportunity for us to talk to people who will be in the system about the topic. And in the same time, what was said by Tali, like to really stick to the principles and to talk back to the core principles, why we have criminal law, what we want from criminal law, what does it mean to seek justice and reach justice. In the same time, for me, the course is also opportunity to invent maybe different forms how to interact with the students, because it's like the Czech system in not just education but different social fields is based like on hierarchy and on like authority, and like to really sit in the circle and to have discussion on the equal field. It's a different experience for the students. So I think they really appreciate it, and also in that way I get like really nice responses when we conclude the courses. Yeah.
Thank you, Petra. And you're at Palatsky University Olomouc, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And that's great. And we'll talk a bit more later on in the session about the kind of materials and content that are used in different subject areas to teach the practitioners of the future. but I wanted to move on to noting that the big advantage I've found of these roundtables and of doing them by time zone is that they always include people from several different continents. So I'd like to now ask some of you outside of Europe to tell about your experience of teaching restorative justice in your countries. So firstly, Don John O'Malley, you've taught restorative justice to students in Nigerian and in British universities. How do these experiences and cohorts compare? Don John, are you there?
Yeah.
Yes.
Can
Very
you?
good.
Oh, thank you. Nice meeting you again, and the other team that we've met in Bangkok. I can see so many of you here. Thank you. Honestly, restorative justice is an evolving discipline in Nigerian universities. We have been advocating for mainstreaming restorative justice in our criminal justice system for a long period of time now. But we are happy now that the Lagos judicial system is currently implementing restorative justice. And the Nigerian Correctional Service Act of 2019 has also mainstreamed the use of victim offender mediation in the Nigerian Correctional Service. So there's a huge opening for restorative justice training and practices upcoming in Nigeria. Just like Gamma said when she was speaking earlier, most law school students in Nigeria here are very, very monolithic in their idea of what justice should be. Their focus is primarily on retributive justice, and that has been their training for years. But currently, with the opening for restorative justice practices in Nigeria, law school directors of academic training are currently building in training of restorative justice in what they call ADR in Nigeria at the moment. And that is a very good development. So within the ADR course module, there is this mediation and some principles of restorative justice training in the ADR module in Nigerian law school at the moment. And that is also, like I said, a good development. But from my experience in the UK and in Nigeria, I see that the UK has more of opportunities and environments that will lead to practice and development of restorative justice in academic institutions. But just like I said, we are gradually doing that in Nigeria, but I think it will take time. But I hope with your support, things will move on faster in Nigeria. Just to add that before this very workshop, Bianca Kopp has already had some kind of webinar with us in Nigeria here as well, with the UNODC, through the UNODC local office, to try to sensitize the use or application of education for justice module in Nigerian universities. We have had some contact with Bianca Kopp on 2 occasions here, and that's quite impressive. And thank you, Ayan, for organizing this as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Don John. And I'd just like to move to Lani, who teaches restorative justice in South Africa on a number of undergraduate and postgraduate modules, I believe for trainee social workers and also trainee probation officers. Tulani, to what extent do you find that these students can see how to apply restorative principles and processes in their future work?
Ian, thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be part of this roundtable discussion. I'm not familiar with many faces. One person I've worked with is Estelle, in an article I published, I think a few years back, in the International Journal of Restorative Justice. Yes, in response to your question, I do find that at an undergraduate level, because they're not exposed to the realities out there, they're quite punitive in their understanding of what justice is, and they are quite resistant to the idea of restorative justice, just from the beginning. But as you unpack it in the course and show what are the benefits of a restorative justice approach in comparison to a retributive justice approach, then you find that some students, slowly begin to identify with the restorative justice. And then what I also do, I try and link it to the traditional African approach to justice, how we used to respond, in a conflict resolution kind of situation or response to crime. And then they can draw some examples from what they've heard, traditionally, as to say that the Western way came and then introduced another way of justice. But these two forms of justice can in fact complement each other. They're not just against each other. Of course, the best way to go that incorporates, the values of different families and the community would be a restorative justice approach. And then I do find that at an honors level, because we do have an honors program, which does not have many students as we would like, it's because our Bachelor of Social Work degree is 4 years. So those who do come, it means they really have an interest, because it's like a reputation of what you've done a year of your 4th year in social work. But what's good about that, we do also have practitioners who come to do the honors program. We have just recently renamed it to Criminal Justice Social Work. In the past, we used to call it probation and correctional practice. So therefore, we have quite a mix of students. We have those who've been in the field for many years, who are just coming to upgrade their skills and get qualification more to specialize in probation practice. But then you also have the recently graduated students who've never been exposed to practice. And then from there, we can get advanced at a master's level. And I do find that even at an honors level, most of the probation officers do say that it's quite challenging to apply restorative justice in South Africa, given the high crime rate. And also they do find that the attitude of their colleagues in the criminal justice system, the magistrate and some prosecutors, they are still very punitive in their approach, and they find it extremely difficult to recommend it. And even if they do recommend it, they find it is labor intensive, and the workload that they've got doesn't quite allow them to go into detail in terms of preparing, either the offender or the victim, and also the actual convening of the, if it is a victim offender mediation or a family group conference. And given the work pressures that they get where they work, it's actually difficult. However, they do think it's one of the best way which could solve many of, not all of course, but some cases that are ideal for restorative justice.
Thank you so much, Thulani. And just remind us what university you teach at again.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to say, I'm from the University of Cape Town, in South Africa.
Thank you so much. And Don John, I forgot to say also, you're at Federal University of Bukari in Nigeria, I believe. Very good. Okay, so that brings us on to the next broad conversation, which Thulani kindly brought us on to by beginning to talk about the kinds of materials and content that you use to impress upon law and criminal justice students, some of the differences between criminal and restorative justice. And pretty much everyone who's spoken so far has mentioned in one way or another that it differs quite significantly from the assumptions that students make about what justice is, what Don John called a kind of a monolithic viewpoint on what justice is, what others have referred to as punitive or retributive. So, and Thulani, you said that one of the ways you like to deal with that is with reference to sort of historical practices in South Africa. But I wonder if anyone has any other materials or content or ideas, or how else do you teach restorative justice so as to help students recognize this distinction and begin to maybe open their minds a little bit to alternative types or approaches to justice. Would anyone like to come in on that? Yeah, Anna Matsak from Poland.
Hello, everybody. My name is Anna. I'm Polish, but I'm currently in the Netherlands. I'm a criminologist currently based in The Hague. Just as a background to my employment and how restorative justice fits into this, I teach on a program that is called Safety and Security Management Studies. So our point of reference is not so much justice, but safety and security. So when I teach restorative justice, or when I introduce this concept, it's mainly for students to think differently about safety and security. Although criminology is one of the 3 pillars of the program, again, I have the same experience as all of you, that there is a quite strong punitive paradigm dominating among students, but also my colleagues and our partners who collaborate with us. So just to answer Ian's question, what I do on one of my criminology courses, which I try to be very, very applied. This course, it's called Advanced Criminology, and it's divided into different themes. And each week represents different theme. And in 1 week, we talk about criminal justice in general. We talk about courts, we talk about prosecution, about sentencing, and we finish this week with a mock trial. We have a case that we use for that trial. And then the week afterwards, it's an entire week on restorative justice, where we introduce the theory, the practice, we have a guest lecture, and we finish this week with a mock restorative justice conference. And we use the same case that was used the week before that. And all students participate in both, in the trial, in the mock trial, and in the restorative justice conference. And that was designed by me on purpose so they can experience both types of conflict resolution. And of course, it is quite it's a quite powerful tool, because they realize how much more empowered they feel when they can basically express their view on the case, rather than when it's controlled by a different by the courtroom setting or different professionals. So that's how I try to break that punitive paradigm a little bit in my own program. So that would be to answer your question, Ian.
Thank you so much, Anna. That's really interesting, because I know that a lot of restorative justice training programs use role plays of restorative conferences. And of course, some people also bring that into their teaching in higher education. But I'm yet to encounter people who would intentionally use role plays of both, so as to kind of emphasize the distinction. That's really interesting. Thank you. And Grazia, would you like to come in on that?
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's so interesting to hear and learn from you all. Well, I am Grazia Mannozzi, and I work at the University of Insubria in Italy at Como Lake. And we have a multi-level teaching of restorative justice. We teach restorative justice for university students, and we have also a master program for practitioners. So at university, we have a mixed group of law students, but also students of the Faculty of Modern Language for Communication and International Cooperation. And I think it is a very good experience. To say the truth, at the University of Insubria, we founded the first university course of restorative justice in Italy. So it was in 2005, so we have 15 years of experience in teaching restorative justice. And it's a quite good experience, because I can try to make a very short SWOT analysis, but the strength is that we can go to the roots of justice with the students, and we can overcome the idea that studying law means focusing on law norms, and that's all. So they have an holistic approach to conflict, and they can see how conflicts may be also a resource and not only a problem, of course. One problem is that teaching restorative justice at university level leaves few times for practice. Normally at the end of the course we promote a circle on a real conflict which is brought by one of the students. I noticed that after the restorative justice course, they have a renewed way of communication, a more respectful way of communicate each other. And this is a great result, according to me. As for the master program for practitioners, we promoted a very strong collaboration between academia and mediators and facilitators. Now they are trainers at university for those who want to become mediators or facilitators. So we have this mixed approach, theory, but many hours devoted to practice and role plays. So our master program is around 200 hours, so it lasts 1 year. And yes, that's all. This is our experience. I see one problem. It's very hard to communicate the importance of teaching restorative justice at law faculties to my colleagues and other academics, and also to magistrates, and even to the community. Many people say, so restorative justice, what is that? And also my colleagues believe that a law faculty is a sum of criminal law, civil law, commercial law, and so on. But I really see the changements in the students who attend the course of restorative justice. That's true. Thank you.
Thank you, Grazia. And Anna Maria, would you like to come in on that?
Hello, everyone. My name is Magikensiana Opra. I'm currently based in Leicester, in England, and I teach at the Montfort University. And if I were to speak about how we teach restorative justice in the city, because the city does have 2 universities, and I am in touch with the University of Leicester as well, we do have different approaches. In my university, for criminology students, we have a full module, which is an elective module. So obviously, students going into that module have a vested interest, keen interest in finding out about restorative justice. Whereas at the University of Leicester, they teach restorative justice as a topic. And if we were to look at the Education for Justice module that the UN has developed, that would be something similar that's happening at the University of Leicester. As well, given that I am a social worker, I've trained to be a probation officer, and I have knowledge from both fields, social work, especially children's services, and within criminal justice. My way of teaching, I think, is different. So I teach both criminology students for an elective module, and I also teach social work students within very focused skills days, which takes a whole day. And is dedicated fully for restorative justice. So to answer your question, Ian, about materials used, I found that it's very important when teaching restorative justice to connect it with practice, to connect it with what is really happening in real professional life. So I invite guests to lectures. We do work together, we teach together, and we embed restorative justice ways of thinking into the teaching. For example, we always start the lecture with a circle. So the focus is on how to understand restorative justice from a relationship perspective, how it shapes and builds and reconnects people whenever something happens. We use a lot of case studies, and all of them are real case studies, obviously redacted, but they come from real life, and we work around those a lot. Whenever I am teaching, I use a lot of videos, and I think videos are really important, and updated videos are really important. And I think as a community, we need to work more around producing things that are readily available and open to everyone. For me, mock conferences and then discussions around that conference that students can watch in their own private time, that's really, really important. As well, when it comes to building skills, we do a lot of role play, and it takes time, and it also, you have to think of who you're teaching and how much time you have. For example, when it comes to social work students, because we only have a limited amount of time, we don't do extensive role play. It's just a quick half-an-hour role play. Whereas when you have a full module, like with the criminology students, then you have more time, and you gradually introduce the students into the method, and you see that after a month or so, they get more used and more easily go into the role play and using that method. So to conclude, I think from my perspective, teaching restorative justice to different students from different backgrounds, of different ages, and with different rationales for engaging with restorative justice learning, as a community, we need to produce more materials that can be used to kind of develop a pedagogy of restorative justice teaching, because we need that, and to think outside of the box as well. In one of my last sessions for the criminology student teaching is to think outside of the box about restorative justice. What is mainstream restorative justice? What is traditional way of restorative justice, and how we can creatively embed restorative principles in different ways of working in a context. Just to give an example, youth justice services sometimes struggle with inviting victims to conferences. So they need to, anyone that's working within a youth justice service, they have to learn how to apply restorative justice principles in activities that aren't necessarily, we don't call them necessarily restorative justice processes. So kind of widening the concept of what restorative justice is without losing its core ethos and its core principles. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. And Patrizia, would you like to come in on the subject of the kind of materials that you use with your students?
Thank you, Jan. Thank you for this opportunity. I am very happy to can share with you some reflections. I teach at the University of Sassari in Italy, and I am teaching Restorative Justice Science 2015. And before in the Department of Political Sciences, and now from Science 2017 in the Department of Humanities and Social Science. My courses are, I established all these courses. I introduced in the University of Sassari Restorative Justice, and so are the first courses in my university, but also the Think course, the first courses in my country with a psychological framework, because I am a psychologist, a juridical psychologist, and a psychotherapist, and we work a lot on well-being of people, of person, and community. And next year, also a postgraduate specialization course in restorative justice and mediation for well-being of a person, for individual and community well-being will start, and will start in next year. And I think that the broader aim is to promote cultural change, precisely starting from the practitioners of the future, and so social workers, lawyers and prosecutors, school teachers, policymakers, and etc. The main goal of a university and post-university teaching must be to accompany towards the assumption of a new paradigm, changing lenses, with the words of Howard there, to make a fundamental shift from justice as a set of laws and procedures to justice as a value. I believe this is the way to another essential step, which concerns the common sense of restorative justice. At least in Italy, there is a widespread notion that restorative justice is a soft justice and is mainly useful for offending, for the offenders, to have less severe penalties. In my experience as teacher, this brings with it a perception of injustice and the activation of feelings of revenge. The change occurs when students understand that restorative justice looks at the needs of all parties, starting precisely from the needs of the victim to be listened to and considered, to receive accountability by the offender and reparation. From this point, it's also possible to recognize that the importance that the offender is put in the conditions to work for a better life and to grasp the preventive sense of restorative justice. To activate this process, this change of vision, it's essential to use an active and participatory method in the courses. Students must be solicited to reflect on their experiences of harm suffered or done, on their needs on those occasions, on their expectations of solution, on what it means starting from everyday life to put things right. Much individual and group experience are needed, soliciting students to get involved. Classroom dialogue circles are powerful resources, as well as simulations, role-playing games, personal stories, observation of daily life to be discussed in small groups and in the classroom, videos and films. In summary, a method that leads to building together values, principles, practices of restorative justice. And finally, to allow professionals of the future to be with people, it's important to undo their professional techniques and tools and to train them while listening to the many possible stories. This is my experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Patrizia. Those are some really good insights from everyone there on teaching restorative justice, particularly in law and in criminology. And a few things that came through very strongly was the importance of videos. And I know a number of good videos in the English language where victims and offenders tell their stories, but we have fewer in the English language which actually show real life or close to real life conferences. And I wonder also if perhaps in other languages there is a deficit of videos of that kind. I would note also that people talk a lot about role plays there. That's something that I should really try to use next time in my classes, because I didn't do that this year. But what I do try to use is games, and I would just point you in the direction of this new book that just came out, Pointer et al.'s Restorative Teaching Tools, and they use a lot of games. And I think what's really useful in that book is, well, a number of things, but in particular, they talk about how games are very useful for teaching theory, which is not something I'd really focused on. I think, like many others, I try to get people to think about, restorative justice by showing them how it works in practice, and almost work backwards from that might be easier sometimes. But to have more activities which really help us to delve into the theory, I think would be useful. So I'd like to move on then to ask those of you who teach in a Department of Education or who teach trainee teachers a little bit about your own work and your own experience. So if I may start with Hilary from the University of Cambridge. You teach in peace education, if I'm not mistaken. So can you tell us a little bit about your work there and how that relates to restorative justice?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me today, Ian. Yeah, so I work at the Faculty of Education in Cambridge, and there I supervise masters and PhD students who are researching about education, peace and conflict. Increasingly, we're doing more work in settings of crisis and conflict and emergency. So a lot of my PhD students are from countries like Syria and Afghanistan and so on. But I am also supporting teachers in the UK who are working in settings of urban conflict and violence. And restorative justice, restorative approaches are very much central to the work that we do around education and peace. We use Johan Galtung and the concept of positive and negative peace, and also the ideas of peacekeeping, peacemaking and peace building. So a lot of the work that I do with my master's students is around conflicts literacy. So when it comes to peacemaking, how they might recognise the range of strategies that can be applied in a conflict situation, and when restorative approaches are actually most appropriate. Those of you that know my publication will know that I'm actually very critical of restorative approaches being used as an umbrella term, because I think that it becomes motherhood and apple pie and everything and nothing if it's used too broadly. And so I feel that restorative approaches need to be used in a situation where there's been harm, where there's been a recognition that harm has been done, and where there's a willingness to make reparation or to communicate in order to work out a good next step. I think that sometimes mediation, peer mediation, is more appropriate. I think sometimes in the reality of schools, which have to engage in negative peace and peacekeeping, that more punitive methods are, or certainly based around behaviourist methods of sanctions and rewards and these kinds of approaches are going to be necessary. They're going to be in there. They're going to be as part of the mix. And so I like to encourage trainee teachers to be able to analyse conflict better and to know what approach to use to be proficient in the various approaches that they could use. But also finally to be able to think about issues of sustainability, because again in my work I have found that restorative approaches, mediation type approaches, tend not to be sustainable over the years as head teachers come and go, as different initiatives become flavour of the month or not flavour of the month. These things are taken up, they're dropped, they're reappropriated, they shift. And so understanding the ground as well that we're introducing restorative approaches into is extremely important. One of my students, PhD students, Luke Roberts, has just completed, and his PhD was looking at complexity theory and how we can think about theories of change better by drawing from complexity theory and thinking of schools of ecosystems. So having a better understanding of how to manage and bring about change where we have equal and opposite and other and different approaches that are all going to impact on how we think about peace and conflict in schools. So I think to summarise, I would say that conflict literacy is important, particularly for busy teachers, but also understanding schools as systems and how we can embed and approach restorative approaches is also a very important part of what I do.
Thank you so much for that, Hilary. And I think there is a lot of people writing in restorative justice and restorative practice now that are beginning to think about it more as a cultural shift that is needed within institutions rather than the sort of instigation of what might be unsustainable I guess, programs. And to that end, I'd like to move on to Vincenz and ask you, Vincenz, I know you're working on what you've called relational pedagogy. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your work in that area?
Well, work maybe would be too big of a word. We are starting with our group of research group. We are starting to investigate research on this concept. But our idea is really not very like theoretical. It's more related to what happens daily in schools. So to me, my approach, my restorative approach is not so much about theory or about really establishing something written on stone, but on really an ongoing idea. So, for example, my idea of relational or restorative pedagogy would be related to the idea of when Wendy at the start, she presented us the materials. There was a part in each material which is possible class structure. So I thought, what would be a class structure which is congruent with restorative practice, with the restorative approach? And to me, the most congruent approach is generally an approach which works at the same time the task, which is the content you are trying to teach, and also the community building part. So I feel that you have students who are really there to get some knowledge, but also they are working as a group and they are working as a community. And I think that if you build community while you teach, things are going to go much better. And I think that's very restorative. What I mean in practice is to design didactic strategies which use a lot of group work so students can learn the content and at the same time get to know each other, get to trust each other, get to learn how to work together, change who you are working. I mean, change like working people, you know, every class, like changing who's working with whom. So I think that theory is excellent, but teachers deal with day-to-day stuff. So I think it's very important to design strategies so they can teach in a way that, as I'm saying, they build community and also like deliver the content, or the content is co-constructed with everybody. I don't know if that's clear enough.
No, absolutely. And I think we miss a trick by not being sufficiently attentive to the climate, because we might assume that, you know, we need to get across a bit of information, but in reality, our students leave the university having experienced the sum total of all the interactions they had with us and with each other. And so that's very important as well. And I'd like to move on then to asking Michelle Stowe, who teaches with me at Maynooth University in Ireland, but also is a trainer in restorative practices and rolls it out within schools. So Michelle, can you tell us a little bit about your work and how it applies to your teaching, and maybe how do you bring the training experience to also your teacher training work, your teacher education work?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Lovely to see you all. I think similar to what Vincenz was saying there, I guess I'm very passionate about trying to encourage teachers to teach relationally and to think relationally. And I guess the best way I can do that is to try and model it as best I can, you know, in the spaces where I get to teach or lecture. Sometimes it's a challenge, you know, when there's 160 or 200 of them and the desks don't move. So trying to be creative around that, I guess, as best I can. So we do stuff like multiple concentric circles or walking debates, or sometimes we can be found out in the park out of the back of the lecture theatre, and, you know, trying to encourage those think, pair, shares, just to trying to model that as much as I can. I think the practice is a huge, and their experiences of it. I guess whilst teaching and lecturing in that space, trying to be explicit about that as much as I can, and encourage them then to kind of model that in their own classrooms. Trying to move conversations in schools beyond behaviour management, and instead, again, trying to think of what Vincenz was talking about, creating relational learning communities.
I love what Hilary was saying there about trying to offer teachers conflict literacy. And one of the key components, I guess, we use in our lectures is also the importance of reflective practice, trying to be reflective about who I want to be in situations that we might find ourselves in. As opposed to how can I make him or her do what I say, you know, because schools and teachers are very attached to managing people and controlling environments. And it is that paradigm shift that many of you have spoke about already, and trying to support them with that, and look internally. That's something that we do a lot. I guess when I'm thinking about teachers, I want to work with teachers, trying to encourage them to link it into the curriculum when they can too. Like, for example, I used to teach English, so if I was exploring a character, I would try and use restorative inquiry or functional writing, using the restorative questions to scaffold a diary entry, or just trying to be innovative or creative in trying to build a literacy in language, not just for the teachers, but in the communities within which they work, you know. So I guess that's it's gained a lot of traction in an Irish context in the educational space. So I started in the university there about 5 years ago, just as a one-off lecture, then it grew to 2. And now they've actually replaced, they used to have behavior management as a major component, and now they don't have that anymore. And I deliver this module as a large component of the postmasters in education teacher training course. So it's gained a lot of traction. I think it's great that they have practical skills and tools perhaps to support them, and also ways of thinking maybe that can support them as well when they're in their classrooms, in the schools, which can be punitive, and there's systems in place that can navigate them away maybe from their values, the reasons why they became a teacher in the first place. So I guess reflective practice is big, and trying to model it as much as we can, thinking of pedagogy and how we teach and how we communicate in our classrooms, you know.
That's great. Thank you so much, Michelle. And it's really interesting to hear, I think, from people who do restorative justice or restorative practice training, and then how that influences the way that we teach. We do more sort of restorative justice education in universities. But likewise, it's really interesting to hear about people who facilitate restorative justice in practice and how they bring that into their teaching. So I'd like to move to Marie Keenan, who's another colleague of mine from Ireland who teaches at UCD and teaches restorative justice to social work students, if I'm not mistaken, but also has a practice of facilitating restorative justice in cases, in quite serious and complex cases. So Marie, could you tell us a little bit about how you bring that experience of practice to your teaching?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ian, and hi to everybody. Okay, so just a little about the teaching. First of all, I teach restorative justice to undergraduate students in their 3rd year of undergraduate studies in a general social science degree. So they don't get a whole module on restorative justice, they might get 3 or 4 sessions from me. And part of that, I do the intro to restorative justice and some of the big debates, but really 3 of the 4 sessions are on complex cases. So my students at undergraduate level get straight into where my own area of practice is, if you like. And the logic for that is I give them, the first session is basically about principles and so on in general of restorative justice. But then for the next 3, we talk about homicide, we talk about sexual violence, and we talk about domestic abuse. And I find doing it that way, that if the students get with the big questions in the bigger, challenging, more complex areas, it's kind of easier for them to get with the so to speak, lesser challenging approaches, if you like. And then the second part of my teaching, I teach Masters in Social Work students who do a 2-year full-time training in social work. And I teach justice and human rights. And again, as part of that, I teach them a few sessions on restorative justice. The university, the school are inclined to say, oh, they're getting too much of that, we've more of this to do, and so on. So it's constantly trying to slip it in places that might be interesting and useful, whilst in a very heavy, if you like, content-driven program. What I notice is a lot of our students come from, and not all, but a lot come from the undergrad to the master's program. And we're now seeing, because I've been teaching this a few years at undergraduate level, that they're really interested in it, by the time they come to the master's, and a lot of their master's theses are, when I say a lot, a significant number are interested in doing restorative justice with youth offenders, restorative justice in challenging cases, and blah, 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 and pushing out the boat a bit. So I'm really happy about that. So it's kind of alive and well, and we're doing okay. So to answer the question specifically, how does my facilitation influence this? Well, it's like I've been there in so many cases now, in complex cases, that students' feedback to me is that my own kind of passion for it and commitment to it, and honesty about the complexities, and I have case examples at my fingertips, not, you know, that I've been witness to and party of, and moments from preparation meetings and so on that I can call up at will, and that just brings it alive in a way that, you know, is not just simply theoretical, so to speak. I've been there, I've been able to tell them when I went out to open the door what happened, this woman turned back in a risk situation or whatever. So that really has helped enormously from the feedback from students. I've also been able to bring in, not all the time, but sometimes people who have participated in restorative justice meetings with me to do a talk for students. And then, you know, that's not always possible, but that has helped also. And then, of course, I use, like everybody else, I use videos, of small videos that are short enough videos that are useful. Some of the beyond conviction ones I find very helpful. And then, of course, we have our own film that we made here in Ireland, but it's 93 minutes long, and it's too long to show in a class when time is limited. But I often do a session outside of it and say, look, I'm running the film if anyone wants to come, and whatever. People have brought their mothers to see the film. You know, somebody in their family who's experienced sexual violence or whatever. Some people have brought their mothers to classes, or their father to a class, and they sit in at the back of the class because the topic is of interest to them when I have flagged it up in advance. So I think there are a couple of things so that's about the teaching and the practice. I mean, a couple of the things that are on my mind, theoretically we can come back to it if you like, but I'm really now beginning to think that certainly in Ireland, we're doing well, as Michelle said, in getting this kind of, and mainly since Ian came to the country and coordinated us and whatever, we're doing well at getting the discourse changing and the openness. And with the victim directive, we know that, you know, restorative justice is there. I don't think we're even touching the role of community and community integration, certainly in restorative justice and certainly in complex cases. And I don't think we're touching the whole reintegration of offenders debate at all. We've come through a history here in Ireland of, you know, sexual abuse by the Catholic Church. We've a lot of domestic abuse and domestic violence and so on. And so people are beginning to think this could be useful in complex cases as an additional justice mechanism for victims. But I don't think we've begun to get anyone with the idea. They know it could be helpful for offenders, but we haven't really begun to get at the whole reintegration and changing kind of values and all that bit. Not really. And I don't think it's only an Irish problem. I think when I've looked, and Estelle and myself are writing this book on when victims want to meet offenders, and we're almost finished it now, but when I've been looking at literature to do with sexual violence and when victims want to meet offenders and so on, and looking at lots of stuff, you know, we've mechanisms, we're able to address all the challenges, we're able to internationally and all that, but I don't think we've begun to really touch the really sensitive issue of how this can be helpful in the reintegration of offenders and also in the role of community. That's my view on the matter.
Thank you so much for that, Marie. And just for people who are watching this retrospectively, I would note that the film Marie is talking about is called The Meeting. And a number of people in the side chat here have said that they show it to their students and it's very valuable. I also show it to my students. I'm lucky that my master's restorative justice course is 2-hour sessions. And so I did just about have time to squeeze it into one session there, but I cannot recommend it highly enough. As a visualization of restorative justice in a case of very serious sexual harm. So what I'd like to do now then, thank you for that, Marie, is to turn to participants among us who have been in the fortunate position of establishing or teaching on full bespoke programs in restorative justice and restorative practice. And firstly, I'd like to turn to Tim Chapman from Ulster University in Northern Ireland to tell us about your master's in restorative practice. Please, Tim.
Hi. Yes, I mean, I should say that I retired finally from Ulster in December last year. But I'll tell you a bit about the work I did there. Since then, I've been, doing bits of teaching in other universities. So we set up the course in 2002 as a response to new legislation, which implemented restorative justice throughout our youth justice system. And basically, pragmatically, the Youth Justice Agency needed to have a lot of people trained to a high level to undertake this work. And so we designed a course and a practice manual to do that. And that was a sort of a 10-day course, very practical, lots and lots of role play, a lot of what people have talked about. Quite a rigorous course because it was to qualify people for justice in the heart of the criminal justice system. And they were going to do nothing else but restorative justice. It wasn't sort of something they did as part of their job. And that then eventually became a certificate, a postgraduate certificate. But then, interestingly, the course sort of grew organically because people would come back and say, just connecting up with what Marie's just talked about, we're getting a lot of sexual harm cases. We're not sure how to deal with them, so we have to get experts in, because I'm not an expert in this field, to elaborate on that. That became a module, and then other people were saying a lot of the offenders have learning disabilities. Our law meant that they had a right to participate in a restorative conference. They couldn't be excluded because they had learning disabilities. These are people maybe on the spectrum. So again, I'm not an expert, so I had to get people in to help design different processes that suited people who were autistic or didn't have good linguistic skills. And so it grew and grew and grew until we had so many modules and it became a diploma. And then, of course, people started asking, do you have a master's? Can we do some research? And so then we added on research methodology and dissertation. And after a few years, it just grew into a master's. And so and we got students. It went beyond the Youth Justice Agency. We have a very active community sector. Marie was talking about that. We do have a strong community sector within restorative justice in Northern Ireland. So they were coming on, and prison service, police, teachers, social workers, and it just sort of grew. So universities regularly revalidate their courses, so we had to sort of think about what the course was now. It was getting a bit unmanageable. There were so many different sectors coming in, and we were just adding modules. I think at one stage we had 14 different modules. And by the way, this was a part-time course, and it was aimed at people in the field at postgraduate level. And so eventually, just to cut a long story short, I think if I was to sum up the course, it was in most people did it part-time over 3 years. The first year, I would say the theme was competence, practice skills, and also learning how to reflect on practice so that they could continuously learn from their own experience, which ultimately I think is the best way to learn restorative practices from your experience, as long as you've learned how to, you know, what the basic principles are and how to reflect. So that would have been the first year. And the second year, if you like, the diploma year, that was the certificate. I would say the theme there was contexts and concepts. So you've got competence, context, and concepts. Context for the different applications. And what we discovered very early, we started off with a youth conferencing model, but then we started teaching people in the community and realized that youth conferencing is very sort of attached to criminal justice concepts, which me personally, who'd worked in criminal justice all his life, didn't recognize. They were invisible to me. Suddenly, when you're talking to people working in the community, they say that doesn't make sense. So we had to sort of radically change the processes for community. And then as Michelle and Vincent and Hilary would know, that we started teaching teachers and they realized we don't have time to have these elaborate conferences. And so we had to completely change the processes. So going back to an earlier question that you raised about how to help people learn restorative justice, I think the encounter with reality is a great learning, whether it's a role play or whether it's saying, how would this work in the police? So the context part of it was getting people to look critically at their own occupational sector and apply restorative justice to problems that they're encountering there, and adapting restorative principles and values to a process or a practice that would work in that context. And then the concepts are basically just critical theory, creative thinking, because I mean, my personal views about restorative justice is there's a lot of magical thinking in restorative justice. That's just a lot of people bring their own ideas into restorative justice and elaborate on it. So I think it's very important. I think one of the functions of a university is to teach people critical thinking, and that justice is not critical too, or it'll just go a little bit crazy and not be taken seriously by the public or the people we want to engage with. So the critical thinking was important, and that's what we looked at. You know, the underlying ideas, like people have already. What is justice? What is community? And to look at some of the sort of cultural critical theorists on some of these concepts in more detail. And then the third year was, as I say, research methods, and students would make a proposal for research in the field, and if it was approved, then do some field research and write a dissertation on it. So as I say, it sort of grew that way, and I mean, it seems quite elaborate, but each of those areas, I think, engaged students in encountering real reality and applying restorative values and ideas to that reality. And often what we would have said when we reflect is that in learning restorative justice, you spend most of your time unlearning. Unlearning what you brought into the course from your previous sort of practice. Not that that's wrong, it's just it was appropriate for being a police officer, but not being a restorative practitioner. So a lot of it was challenging students to unlearn and learn something that is ultimately quite a simple thing, in spite of me going on about a sort of master's course in it. And the other thing I would just want to say is that you really struggle if you do go that way within universities' own conservatism, because restorative justice doesn't have a sort of academic credibility. It can be a module within a law course, or within a social work course, or within an education course, or within a criminology course. But academics are pretty conservative, and they just don't see that it could be an academic discipline in itself, in its own right. And as a result, I think, when I started to sort of retreat from Ulster, the authorities decided to put it in cold storage. So it's sustaining restorative justice as a legitimate academic subject, I think, is also a challenge within the conservatism of academic life.
Thank you so much for that, Tim. And not to indicate that there's going to be some sort of Irish monopolistic takeover of this, but I'll just move on also to Catherine, if I may, who teaches with me at Maynooth University and teaches at the Edward Kennedy Institute for Conflict Intervention. Can you tell us a little bit about your own restorative practices programs?
Yeah, the certificate in mediation and restorative practices is the name of the course, and it's a level 8 20 credit course that people take, and often the people are practitioners of some sort or other, but there's a huge variety. So the course covers restorative justice, restorative practice, and then alongside with that it also teaches some mediation skills. But I suppose we start off in a way looking at the whole philosophy of restorative justice. And I suppose I teach, like Michelle would say, and like Vincenz would say, really modeling a relational focus, if you like. So basically, it's run in a very, hopefully, I try to run it in a very restorative way. But I suppose the breadth of it sometimes is because you have people from a lot of different backgrounds. So I have policemen and women, restorative youth justice workers. This year there was 3 principals of the school of schools in there as well, and then just people who are really interested in the whole subject matter. So and there's a few of us involved in the program, so it's not just me, but so we look at I suppose the theory behind it, some of the theory behind it, looking at, so the first 2 article reviews they do, one of them is Tim's on the balance model, so they've to do an article review on that. And they've to do an article review on Christie's conflict as property, and look at that, and also look at, I think Christie's article is really interesting if you relate. He talks about how we've learned, you all know that we've all learned not to be able to manage conflict. So part of the teaching is also conflict theory and how people have different conflict styles. But so along with sort of teaching the philosophy, then it goes into, so what are your beliefs, what are explicit restorative beliefs and assumptions, and then so what are the practices, and then people, like Tim has said and other people have said, they've got to go work in places where the system is not restorative. So often teachers are going in there, so we use restorative circles and talking circles, and people have to figure out how they're going to manage when there's a dissonance between the system, which is very non-restorative maybe. So there might be restorative practices in a school where they have to give children detention, so the system isn't restorative, but there's restorative practices in there. So there's that type of things that people look at. We use role plays also quite a bit, and we try and get people to do real plays also. So people, a huge big part of it is about reflective practice as well, and who am I and how am I, and if somebody responds to me in a non-restorative way, how do I stay restorative in my life? Another, which I think is quite a nice assignment for people to do, is a process recording where they record themselves playing, facilitating or mediating, and they go back and go through what were they thinking, what were they feeling, what assumptions were they making, what was the consequences of their intervention and those types of things. I think that's quite good. And all the different, I really think the importance of working with shame and how people manage shame is core to, you know, and again, I think that's everywhere. It's in the workplace, it's in, you know, so how do people manage shame? And so people have to do an essay on shame, you know, in its relationship to restorative justice and to healing. And everybody, they have to do a project in groups, some sort of a project where they engage in a restorative way with the real world, somewhere in the real world. But so after COVID happened, you know, we went online and we had a class online, and I thought was really good. I thought was one of the principals said he actually ran a circle with all the staff to find out how they were doing. So, you know, it was nice to see the relational piece carrying through. So, and the whole thing, dissonance is my word of the moment. How do you cope with dissonance? And what Tim says about getting about it, restorative justice, restorative approaches and mediation being seen as legitimate courses of study in academia is very tough. So is that it? Have I missed anything? I think that's me, Ian.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, Catherine. Really appreciate it. And I'll move then on to Jerry Johnstone from the University of Hull, who helped establish the Masters in Restorative Justice there. So if you'd like to tell us a little bit about that master's program, Jerry, and then also the fact that you used a lot of distance and blended learning, if I'm not mistaken. So you could tell us a little bit about how that worked and your experience with that, please.
Yeah. Just before doing that, I mean, if I could just have a couple of minutes on one of the previous questions, like, because I do, I teach. Most of my teaching is actually for undergraduate law students, you know, who were asking why I didn't want to come in, you know, sort of earlier on that, but yeah, I just wanted to echo something Tim said earlier about, you know, the importance of unlearning, and, you know, sort of, because I mean, one of the challenges I have in teaching law students in general, like, you know, I find is the need, is they think they actually know what law is, and that what they're coming to university for is to learn all the detail, and they kind of see their legal education as a kind of, you know, as a technical task. You know, it's acquiring more and more technical knowledge, yeah, and you know, which goes, you know, quickly goes out of date. Like, you know, I've always tried to find a way of getting them to say, well, you know, we have to start off disturbing our understanding of what law is. Like, you know, so sort of, you know, education is very much about disturbing what people think they know rather than actually trying to teach them new things. Like, yeah, and yeah, I was trying to find a way of doing that with law students without getting them involved in very heavy, you know, analytical jurisprudence, which is very off-putting for most law students. And, you know, I found restorative justice really good for that. Like, I mean, you know, it just says that restorative justice comes from a different tradition of thinking of what law is. Like, you know, there's Berman's, you know, great book on law and revolution, like, you know, which brings out that in a more theoretical way. But yeah, so I just want to tackle that before starting. But sorry, to turn to your question about the masters, which is again going back to a point that a couple of people have made about sustainability, that the masters in education is now defunct for institutional reasons, like, you know, sort of where just with shifting institutional priorities, I've been diverted to kind of other things, and found that, you know, for a while I was trying to sort of, you know, do 1.5 jobs within one, and just it wasn't working. Like, you know, so yeah, I think things had to go. Like, yeah, which is a great regret. Okay, so the masters started around about 15 years ago now, like, and the origin of it was based, you know, in really simple terms. It was I was just giving papers at conferences and so on, and with lots of practitioners there, like, and talking about ideas. And somebody, you know, asked me, like, is there any way we can learn about this? Are there any, you know, sort of courses that we can do? And, there's lots of training stuff available for to train to be a restorative practitioner, but not much on the kind of deeper theoretical ideas and concepts and so on. And I was looking at the time, like I thought, well, not really. Like, I mean, yes, it's sort of not a lot that's accessible. Like, I mean, anyways. So, and I was just finishing a stint as head of department and looking for something new to do. So I thought I'll start one. Like, the kind of sort of foolish kind of sort of decision something was made. But I did put a team together, and we did actually launch what I thought was a really exciting and interesting. It was an online MA in restorative justice, and probably at the time the only online MA in restorative justice that existed. Very briefly, the content of it. Well, sorry, let me tell you. The aims of it were basically to try to teach. We had lots of practitioners, people who were already very knowledgeable, coming to do the course. So that was one thing, and we were trying to teach them about some of the background ideas and contexts, because typically people would come into restorative justice from one specific field, and they'd know quite a lot in one area, but not actually realize the whole other dimensions to the phenomenon and to the subject of which they were unaware. Familiarizing people with a range of practices and ideas. What one of the crucial goals for us was actually getting people to learn from each other, like teaching the masters online especially. I had to reconceive my role, and my colleagues were really helpful in this. We became more facilitators of learning rather than teachers as such. So it was more about just having people in conversation with each other and making sure that conversation actually worked. So which was actually very liberating in a way, because once it got working, we could stand back a lot and just let people converse with each other. And another goal was basically for people working in organizations, empowering them by giving them the tools to communicate about what they were doing, the critical thinking skill. So, but basically, it's a fairly for English universities, a traditional master structure of 6 taught modules, and then 1/3 of the course was a research dissertation. So we covered things like we had modules on victims, crime and justice, peacemaking, criminology, crime, justice and punishments, principles of restorative justice, international restorative practices, and we had another one which was on a combination of research methods and critical thinking. Again, because unusually for a master's course, we had people come back who had been out of education for 20 years. We did actually take some people onto the course who did not have an undergraduate qualification, and we took them capable of actually benefiting from it. The course covered, and then the but everything led in a way to the main part of the master's course, doing this big chunk of a research project, where we had people working in organizations who would have a project they wanted to do, they wanted to evaluate it, and we would actually take them through the whole process of researching and evaluating an initiative, a project, being able to communicate the results, thinking about what was involved in persuading people. I mean, a lot of people said, I'm really enthusiastic about it, but my colleagues just can't see it, the managers can't see it. And I thought, how could you write a report that would actually kind of tell people without kind of ramming it down them, like what the benefits of this process are, like what its costs are, what its implications are for the organization, getting them to think about the wider context in which it was working. So and that ran for about 10 years with about 10 students each year in an online environment, which was very the reason we did it online was just we decided straight away that people were not going to en masse pick up sticks and come to Hull to study a master's in restorative justice. They were working, they had jobs, they had lives elsewhere, so it had to be online. We had students from all continents of the world doing it, from very different people from the police, people from probation, from social work teachers, people with no restorative experience with other all sorts of people from all wakes of fields of practice from everywhere around the world, like from sort of coming together to do this course, learning from each other, and hopefully learning from us. One of the frustrations of teaching it online was that because people were at a distance, we didn't have that regular interaction, that we, you like to have, like, with people, and they were an exciting group of people. Like, I mean, every year, a new and a different exciting, there was a different dynamic every year. So we also did try to, we had 2 residential courses that we tried to get people to come to the campus, and at the time in a very different financial institutional climate, sort of I managed to get the university to to fund this so that we could actually bring the people to Hull and spend 3 days of intensive work with them, like talking about their ideas, and that was really exciting material. But so yeah, that was the gist of it. People have gone on to do all sorts of things from there. There are people working in as restorative justice developers. People have developed their own restorative justice practice. They've pushed out practices in different areas of the police. Like, you've kept quite a lot of contact with a lot of people who've done it over the years. Doing all sorts of things. Yeah, I mean, I can answer any more questions about that, but that's the gist of it.
Thank you so much for that, Jerry. That's fantastic. Just before coming to the closing circle, I'd like to turn to Rowan Sweeney, who I know is doing a PhD on teaching restorative justice in universities. Rowan, would you like to tell us just a little bit about what you're doing for your PhD and what you hope to find out?
Yes, hi, thank you. So my PhD is looking at teaching restorative justice in criminology within England and Wales, although hearing from all these different countries, I wish it was looking at more locations. But mainly one of the reasons for the project was considering how future practitioners, especially maybe within criminal justice or any public services, would be coming to learn about restorative justice if they were doing a criminology degree. And also important within that was the recent kind of growth of criminology as a discipline in England and Wales as in other countries, and this idea of in higher education at the moment really having a focus on employability for any degree that you're doing, and how maybe restorative justice fitted in with that. So really what I'm hoping to find out, or what I'm looking at as I've been collecting my data, is firstly, obviously, the approaches and methods used to teach restorative justice, where it is included within different criminology degree programmes. How students respond to restorative justice, the ways they understand it, whether the way they understand it as a practice within criminal justice, but also as a practice within wider society, and as we've kind of spoken about during this session, whether it's used as a way to consider different forms of justice and not just focused on within criminology as being able to be used in the criminal justice system. Also important to consider has been the way restorative justice is considered, so whether it's considered as a kind of abstract idea which is used maybe to question theoretically, for example, different forms of justice and different justice structures, dominant justice structures, or whether it's also being used, or instead of being used and taught as something which can and is being practically used. And lastly, what's come out is kind of the positioning of restorative justice within criminology curriculums, so whether it's being considered as an alternative form of justice, but also within criminology, where it's being positioned, so whether it's maybe included in modules that focus on victims of crime, whether it's been included in general criminal justice modules, or maybe modules to do with mass atrocities and harms, or whether there's some instances of specific modules that look at restorative justice in a really in-depth way. So kind of hopefully finding out about all these kind of components of it will enable me to kind of have a greater insight on how restorative justice is included, and also maybe importantly for future development where it's kind of missing and where it could be included more. So yeah, that's kind of an overview of what I'm hoping to find out.
Thank you so much for that, Rowan. That sounds fascinating. And just to move on then to a closing circle, and I just noticed we're approaching the end of this now, so if you could possibly please just take maybe 30 seconds or so each in response to this question, but I just want to make sure we hear from everyone one more time. I'd like to ask each of you to just reflect on maybe what you took from today, but also maybe what kind of research on restorative justice teaching you think needs to take place. So for me, what I took from today is that I need to think a bit more about how I communicate restorative justice theory to people, and maybe some activities I could do to help people think about that. And linked to that is this concept of unlearning that a few people, that's resonated with a few people. And it'd be interesting to see some research on that actually, and maybe on the order in which you engage people with different materials and different ideas in order to reflect this process of unlearning and relearning, if indeed it is, you know, as linear as that. So what I'm going to do then is I'm just going to go around everyone one by one. As I say, please take about 30 seconds at most. If you haven't spoken yet, please start by introducing yourself and your institution, and maybe you can take a little longer just to give any other reflections on today if you would like, and just say what you took from today, and if there's any research you think should take place on restorative justice teaching, what might that be? So I'm just going to go around where you are on my screen, and I'll start with Gianluigi. And you're just on mute there, so I think I can, yeah, I've unmuted you now.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Gianluigi Lebri. I'm from Italy, and I work with Professor Patrizia Patrizzi. So she already said different things about our institution, but I work especially on teaching restorative justice in graduate courses for other professionals. So that's a topic that's not being touched today. So I work with psychologists, social workers, lawyers, magistrates, and I'm usually holding the module on restorative justice. And what I pick up from today, that I think we have to work quite hard on the curriculum of restorative justice professionals, because, you know, we come from different countries. Even in the same country, sometimes it's not clear what are the main topics, or what are the main concept, or that theory that a professional working on restorative fields has to know. So that's something that I pick up, and I think even research should focus more on that. What is the academic curricula of a professional involved in restorative justice? Thank you, Ian, for this beautiful afternoon anyway.
Thank you. And Michelle? Just unmute yourself, Michelle.
Really enjoyed connecting with everybody. The term, I guess, critical literacy for teachers, and also making explicit what Tim was talking about is how to learn from experience. So I've just stimulated a couple of thoughts around that. Thanks.
And Tim? Just unmute yourself there.
Yeah, several people talked about community building, ecosystem, how Marie's point about perpetrators and reintegration and the role of community. So that's what I'm going to take away, both as an idea, but also possible areas of research. But how do we get away from conceiving of restorative justice as an individual thing, an individualistic process between two people in conflict, or one of whom has been harmed? How do we think broader than that?
Brian Payne?
Yeah, just getting myself unmuted there. How's it going, Ian? Thanks very much for this really interesting session today. I'm a much better listener than I am talking, so I've quite liked just sitting back here and listening to all this brilliant wisdom that's been going over me. But as somebody who has been teaching maybe for about 7 years at Restorative Justice, and 3.5 years of that were in England, and now approaching 3 years here in Northern Ireland, I've actually been sort of startled by the similarities between both cohorts of students. I would mostly teach undergrad students, and every year I sort of find it's almost a little bit of a battle for hearts and minds with the students who arrive, because they can be very skeptical. They can sometimes, you know, sort of display the sort of cultures from their family too. In criminology, a lot of them are from law enforcement style family backgrounds and things like that. And it can be a lot of fun, I think, just, you know, painting a picture of what restorative practices can achieve, and thinking about it from that sort of point of view, and you see them slowly sort of overcoming them. So from my point of view, it is all about highlighting those deficits, I think, in the criminal justice system, in those sort of wider sort of bureaucracies, you know, of rule making within the state, but also then deficits in the community too, around capacity and people working together to deal with their harm and the problems that occur there and things like that. So it's really all about, you know, charting the context for me of where, you know, you can apply restorative approaches, and then putting the students in the place of the victim, of the offender, or of wider stakeholders. And I really enjoyed what Tim said about needing to be critical as well, because you can be very critical of the government and of the state justice apparatus, I suppose, but then it's very easy then to turn it around and then be critical, you know, of what the victims are experiencing around restorative justice. And I think it's nice to flip it on its head every once in a while, just to keep the students on their toes, I think. So the stuff that I'm really interested in is how we can sort of build a more restorative society across all those different avenues. And I was a little bit late today because one of my kids took prominence and had to do a Zoom classroom meeting with their school. And anybody who works in the school environment has my utmost respect from this homeschooling craziness which has gone on for the last 3 months, because I am driven to despair with my 3 kids. But I think the schools are going to be the most important place. I think we need to really instill, you know, restorative principles into people from a very young age, and then they can carry that through right from their, you know, right into their senior schools, into their A levels, and on into university, and then to study it, you know, at later levels, while then using those practices in the communities that they live in. So that's my 50 piece worth. Thanks very much.
Dave Thompson.
Hi there, Ian. Yeah, thank you. My name's Dave Thompson. I'm a lecturer in criminology at the University of Sheffield. We teach undergrad and postgrad restorative justice modules. On the undergrad level, it's generally law and criminology students. And what's been really great to see today is not only the different views of how restorative justice is taught, and certainly some tips for me to take away there. But what's also been really pleasing is to see some of those repeated examples from everyone else. So Brian, you mentioned that the battle for hearts and minds, and that's something that really struck. The black letter law that students come into the sessions with, and it's, you know, this is the absolute purpose of law, and being able to use restorative justice to try and get them to think differently and to think a bit more outside of the box. And so for me, things to take away would be how to integrate theory better. Ian, your book, Lindsay Pointer's book, that one will be definitely something for my reading. And also thank you everyone for the videos in the suggested videos in the chat. They've been really helpful, so I'll be using some of those as well. Thanks for everyone that's organised it.
Anna Markina.
Okay, hello from me. I'm Anna Markina from Estonia, from University of Tartu. And I've just taught my very first restorative justice course, interrupted by COVID. So it was a challenge, or a double challenge, I would say. But to the point, so maybe there are 3 things which I definitely will take with me from today's session. Is use of games to teach theory. It's very interesting. Also, very important statement is that it is important to build community as we are teaching restorative justice. And also, I guess this quote goes from Tim, or I'm not so sure, that we should stick to encounter with the reality, which is very important. And also the question whether research is needed, or I do not know whether it is research, but also it was mentioned here, the didactics, how we can bring it, what are the best ways to bring it to the class. I think it is very important. Thank you.
Stéphane Terreblanche.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Ian, for this opportunity. It was very nice to see a few familiar faces again. I'm a law professor at the University of South Africa, And I'm mainly involved with postgraduate students. I've had quite a few students who did their dissertations on restorative justice. And considering that as a subject area, restorative justice is not really something that's really going on in South Africa. I find it interesting that quite a few people, young people, come up with this topic for postgraduate research all by themselves, showing that the ordinary justice system isn't really working. What I take away from today is that one should never stop working on the issues of restorative justice and never get despondent, but because after all, it really is a very worthwhile pursuit. And as far as research about teaching RJ is concerned, I think in our perspective, it's basically the idea of just getting a society of restorative justice teachers, in the widest sense of the word, together. That would be our main focus for this time. Thanks.
And Don John Amale? Don John, are you with us?
Yeah, are you hearing me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you again. Right in my country here, Nigeria, we have issues with community conflicts, extremism, and so on and so forth. So, and currently the ongoing project by the European Union within Nigerian prisons to do what they call de-radicalization of violent extremist offenders in our prisons. So I am looking at the opportunity of how restorative justice could fit into that kind of program. So a possible application of restorative justice to counter violent extremism is something that is worth looking at in this context. Thank you.
Thank you. And Tally Gal?
Yes, thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure listening to everybody. The main idea that I have is that we should have a joint class together, like a joint course, where each one of everybody here gives one class, or I don't know. Not that I'm volunteering to organize it, but it would be wonderful just to share the joint knowledge that is here. But also I wanted to say that culture and cultural diversity is something that appeared, and I would like to think further about it. I speak with my students, for example, about the sulha, the traditional mechanism in the Arab society, the traditional Arab society, and the differences between the sulha and restorative justice. And I know that there are other traditional justice mechanisms, and it would be amazing just to compare between local, traditional, native justice mechanisms across the different countries. So thank you.
Sonia? Mute there. Unmute yourself.
Sorry, I would like to thank both Ian and Wendy for this opportunity, and especially for Ian for facilitating this meeting. Well, I take a lot from this meeting today, mainly because I feel a little bit alone here in Portugal teaching restorative justice. I don't have people to talk about how to better teach restorative justice. So having the opportunity to hear your experience, people with experience than me, is really important, and thank you everyone for that. I always struggled about the balance between the theoretical approach and the practical approach on teaching restorative justice. So this imbalance for me it's something that I must be always very aware when I'm preparing the teaching. And what I heard today just gave more force to that idea. Relating to the other question you have presented, Jan, about the investigation restorative justice teaching, what I would suggest is a reflection about restorative justice and interculturalism. I think it's quite hard, that topic. I came across that topic some years ago when I started teaching at Kiel University of Applied Sciences, to show this relation between restorative justice and interculturalism is something that I'm really into, but it's quite hard to find people to discuss this topic. So my suggestion is that. So thank
you. Annette?
It was very interesting to hear the perspectives from other disciplines. I myself teach from a law discipline. Currently, I have it as a 4-week sort of component in an advanced criminal practice module, which is an elective. Students are normally very surprised and enthusiastic, but as other speakers said, it's a battle between the heart and the mind, because they immediately question the monetary value attached to it as practicing attorneys in future. What became clear to me this afternoon is that these courses very much depend on personal vision and passion. As I think Tim said, once he retired, the whole course was sort of parked within the university environment. In South Africa, we teach it as we have individual interest. I personally would like to see more research on post-sentencing application of restorative justice principles. We have a lot of violent crime. We have a huge prison population. And we have recently very quietly introduced mechanism, criminal mediation, where the victim has the say. Whether the case should go through on trial or whether they can settle it outside of court. I, by chance, learned about it. It's contained in public prosecution policy. So I would like to see more research on that in South Africa. But thank you, it was very valuable for me.
Marie Keenan.
Yes, thank you very much for everyone. I really enjoyed. Sorry, I was a little bit late joining. I think I got the times mixed up. So sorry about that. For me, I'm left with thinking about sustainability of not only of the practice, but sustainability of the courses in universities. And Estelle and myself found in our research in sexual violence, when we did a global survey around the world on programs, restorative justice programs working in sexual violence field, one of the things we found was that the programs closed when a key person left, or when the person with the passion driving the thing retired or whatever, and also the funding. So I think that happens in practice, and I fear it can happen in the universities as well. Tim referenced it in the University of Ulster. Hugh Campbell is still there, but you know, it's still, the university had other priorities and they decided to put everything as CPD. And I fear, you know, when I go from UCD, that restorative justice won't be heard of again, maybe. So I don't know, in terms of research, I think it's something around that. Yeah, something around that.
Thank you. And Estelle Zinstag?
Yes, hi. My name is Estelle Zinstag. I work at the Center for Criminology in Oxford currently, but I also taught previously at Leuven some courses on RJ, and I regularly teach a module, not a module, just a class in Strathclyde here in Glasgow, where I live. I mostly teach postgraduate students, and they're generally from a very interdisciplinary background, which also very interdisciplinary. I think makes for a very rich mix of people, and it really works well for RJ and for real rich teaching in RJ. In my teaching, I use quite a lot videos for sure, and I think it's my way of being, because I'm not a practitioner, to bring in practice, to bring in real life examples. I also, of course, invite guests, and we go and visit practitioners. I think this is a type of teaching that absolutely needs this. Otherwise, it's just unreal, and it needs to be real. It needs for people to understand. I definitely will take from today the idea. I like the idea of starting each class with a circle. I mean, especially in our classes. I mean, now in Oxford, we were a small group, and we had an hour and a half every week during 8 weeks, and so it would have totally worked. The idea of role play, I didn't use that, but I think indeed it could have really been enriched the classes, the idea of games as well. As to the idea of for research, or what I will take from today as well, is this thing that we really need to work on the sustainability of degrees. I totally agree with Marie and others who have said that it's a real problem, and we've seen it. Jerry's talked about it as well, and other places. Is this really important? I love the idea of Tally about the joint degree. I want to organize it either, but I'm totally on board with you on that. So thank you very much, Ian and Wendy, for organizing this today. It's really amazing. Bye.
Grazia.
Yes, very, very quickly. It was absolutely interesting. We reflected on how teaching restorative justice, and we saw a multidisciplinary approach, new methods, the idea of flipped classroom. I had this perception, and how to move from justice, from technical language to effective language, from law breaking and division of conflicts, from decision-making paradigm to a conflict handling paradigm. But I think we have another question, not only how we teach restorative justice, but also who teaches restorative justice, because people have different background, and it implies different methods. Some started from research, some other from practice, some other from working context. So it is a very wide and differentiate approach. So I think that also this question, who teaches restorative justice, may be important. And at the end, I think that the challenge is to improve restorative justice education and training at several levels, in particularly at the law faculties. I think that it is the precondition for how can I say, for promoting trust in restorative justice, and mainly restorative justice in criminal matters. And also as the precondition to promote awareness of the importance of a holistic approach of lawfulness. So I think we should promote restorative justice education in law faculty, and the idea of common degrees is really fantastic. Thank you.
Bianca Kopp.
Hi, hello, and thank you, everybody. It was a great session for me. I'm not an expert in restorative justice, and I learned a lot today about the teaching on this issue. I'm the coordinator of the Education for Justice tertiary level component, and I always try to participate in this kind of thematic webinars because it helps us to see what works and what doesn't work, as we want to keep the Education for Justice initiative alive and useful for lecturers. And this session today showed me that yes, we definitely have to update some of our models. Yes, we have to include more role plays and games in our models. And we definitely have to continue with this kind of either virtual meetings with academics or face-to-face meetings once COVID is over with academics, to keep an overview on what is really needed at the tertiary level to teach on these important issues. And I agree with Marie and with Tim that have stressed that knowledge management is often an issue, that if one lecturer leaves, the topic is no longer taught at the university. And this is also what we have seen doing an assessment on rule of law related programs at universities around the world. And this is also why we came up with the Education for Justice initiative, to also get new lecturers, junior ones, into teaching on new subject areas such as restorative justice. So thank you, a big thank you from Vienna. It was very interesting for me to participate in today's session. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Wendy, for organizing that.
Edith Torsch.
Thank you. I'm Edith Torsch, struggling with the sun a little bit, which is very rare moment in Belgium, in Leuven, where I'm based. I am not teaching restorative justice. I work for the European Forum for Restorative Justice. And we were invited to these sessions also to see how maybe the European Forum can further support this kind of collaboration. On that level, I think for me to get to know the module by the Education for Justice initiative was really, really useful, and I think it's a really great material. I don't think we can add so much to that, but maybe just draw your attention to the fact that we have a kind of list of RJ courses on academic level, not courses, but those courses which give a degree, some kind of degree in restorative justice. So you can check if your course is on the list, or if you think that we should add yours, or you are aware of others, please let us know, and we are happy to update this list. We also have a films database, because you talked a lot about the importance of videos. So you can check that from few minutes documentaries or interviews. We have full-length feature films, not always with direct links to watch the films, but at least you can have an idea what is out there, including TED Talks and so on. And we also started developing thematic briefs on certain topics. So you mentioned violent extremism, you mentioned sexual violence. These are very, very brief summaries of knowledge on the field. So I don't know how much it is useful for you, but check it out. We have a couple already online. What struck me really as not being in daily contact with students, your shared view on how students, and especially undergraduate students, are punitive in their thinking. And that was kind of surprising for me, or new to me. And I think it really underlines the importance of any kind of course which enables critical thinking and questioning basics. So that's what I take from today with me. Thank you very much for including me in this.
Patricia?
Thank you very much. I spoke and I told you what I think. I learned a lot about the last question. I think we have to work a lot engaging also new researcher in our research. We work a lot at the University of Sassari in action research, in the community, in the prison. And about the question of Grazia, I think that it's an important issue. This we have to reflect on the core attitude and known to teach restorative justice, and this can be the level in common, the topic in common of different disciplines. I think we have to strengthen the competence in restorative justice for people, social workers, for lawyers, and specific for different disciplines and departments. So thank you very much for today.
Ruta?
for being able to participate in your meeting, in your discussion, basically listen to it. It's very interesting, very refreshing, especially for the reason I'm not a specialist in the case. And what I take away is these keywords, the community building, the unlearning, as you mentioned. And I was very interested in the teacher's way of approaching this new thing, because I'm evaluating this project, and what I heard, the very interesting quote I could share here, is that in the places where we want to teach the students of the peace, we are looking for the peaceful teachers. So the peaceful teacher can teach the peaceful student. It's in the context of the law of the justice, crime prevention. Thank you very much for being here.
Catherine O'Connell.
Yeah, what a great session. Thank you so much. Yeah, what I focused on was that notion of relational pedagogy and the trial, you know, role-playing the trial and then role-playing. I thought that was a lovely comparison. As regards my own personal focus is on the notion of a restorative society. That's like Brian said earlier, that's really where I am. And in a way, the need for restorative facilitators and therefore restorative programs to incorporate a level of personal development if you're going to be, you know, working with people who are going out into the field, and in a theoretical research maybe on, or to be focusing on the narrative theory, social constructionism, and the relationship with restorative justice or restorative practice in that way. Thank you.
Anna Matsak.
Yes, thank you all for all your insights and comments. It was a fantastic experience, and these sessions always make me feel that I'm not alone with my daily struggles to promote restorative justice. So it's always a very valuable source of confidence and hope. But what I will take away from myself is basically this. The reflection of on myself and the observation of my own mindset with which I enter a classroom or lecture hall, whether I feel today more like a knowledge provider or knowledge facilitator or relationship builder or facilitator, or whether I should strive to achieve all of the above, because sometimes it's, as teams observed, it's quite difficult to maintain this RJ mindset, especially if you work in a quite conservative academic environment. So that's something that I will try to embed much more and be aware and conscious of my own mindset before every teaching experience. So thank you very much for this.
Anna Opera.
Well, thank you very much, Jan, for organizing today. It's been really brilliant way of thinking of restorative justice at different levels, because I've heard interesting things about teaching at the individual level. Then, but your last question to me speaks volumes around our strategic role in developing the community further. So my reflection is on the role of a higher education institution and the footprint that we have on the local environment, because as I've seen, I mean, I've taken over as lead for this module 2 years ago, and I realized that teaching doesn't happen in a bubble and learning doesn't happen in a bubble. It happens constantly, and we as a university have a key responsibility on the type of future professionals that we're producing. So I think I'm careful with the words, just because I realize that as a higher education institution, we we are very much have a function into generating a sort of both familiarity with restorative justice to social work students, to criminology, policing students, education, psychology, and so on and so forth. So not just familiarity, but also critical thinking. And the amount of time that we receive to do that is very different from one university to another. So if we can have more research or more discussion, group discussion on how we view the place where we work, the higher education institution, within this local environment, and what's our footprint, what's our impact on future professionals. That's and especially, I mean, if you do not know, here at the Montfort, we've been sort of a hub for SDG 16, and all of us as a university, we had to reflect on how we can contribute towards sustainable development goals, and restorative justice plays a role in that as well. So in a nutshell, my reflection for today is for myself, as a person that teaches restorative justice, is what's my strategic role within the restorative justice environment, alongside local authorities, statutory providers, independent providers, trainers, and I am leaving them at last, but I don't think they should be at last, service users, the people who receive the products of our labor. And that's our final impact in the end. And I will take a great idea to invite, actually, to try to reach out not only to professionals, practitioners, when we do the teaching, but also people that have experienced restorative justice into the classroom where possible. Obviously, there's gonna be some barriers around that, but I think it has to, you have to do it in a way or another. I'm currently doing it via using videos and real case studies that professionals have provided me with. But the next step, I think the next level, is even do global trips, because the Montfort University has this global trip program, and we could potentially do field trips abroad around restorative justice. Not only do maybe this collaboration across, programs and degrees collaboratively between countries, but also maybe trips. I don't know. I'm just thinking. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you, Wendy. It's been really nice to be here, and I hope this is going to be happening again.
Tulani? Yeah, Tulani, yeah. Just unmute yourself there.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it was very interesting. I'll never finish, what ideas I've picked up quite a number, like creative ways of studying with very complex cases at an undergraduate level. When you're kind of sensitive and kind of skeptical, you don't want to scare them. But I thought it's something worth trying out, and also, yeah, a number of ideas, games and all that. It was very interesting. Thank you very much.
Petra?
I was thinking that with the teaching, for me, it's not what we discuss, it's not about the content, but for me, it's really important to bring the RJ values into the teaching. So for me, it's about the experience, how to change the traditional teaching, the hierarchical structure, and it's on what I focus a lot on and give a lot of importance. So it's just like what we were talking about, using the circles. I use a lot of videos, role plays, discussions, but also I was trying really to support the cooperational level of the students. So for example, now they don't work alone on seminar works, but they work together in groups and things like that. And what the students always told me, how they were impressed how the circle is working. So it's not just the magic of the circle in the RJ program, but also in any other environment. And in that way, I was also, it was with the teaching for me very important, like how to implement the RJ values in the whole university system. So like I'm also teaching criminal law, and when I was asking students like how they would like reframe and make a new vision for a prison, like to avoid the negative aspects, they were telling me, for example, okay, so we will put every prisoner in a unitary cell, solitary unit, so they won't have bad contacts with each other. And I said it to my department, to my colleagues, that the students have very close thinking and they are punitive. And they said, like, how do you know? And I said, I asked them, and they told me, and don't you think you are wasting a time that's dedicated for the teaching? So on the real stuff, on the real criminal law. So this is really what's striking me, how we teach. And for me, it's the question about the soft skills also of the students. And that's also what we are now focusing with our research proposal. So we are investigating how the teaching methods can affect the soft skills that are coherent with the RJ principles, and how they would be useful for the future of the students and their professional career. And also what we would like to focus on are the like disciplinary codes and methods on the university, like how you apply also RJ principles and attitudes in that direction. So this is like for the research thing. And when I take, like, I really like the word or the expression of the relational pedagogy. So that's something that I got really attached today in the discussion. And thanks so much for involving me. Thank you.
Vincenzo?
Yeah, well, it was very interesting. And yeah, it's interesting that Petra just came before me, because something that I took away is this, when she mentioned before that after teaching her classes, students were interacting in different ways, in a different way. And I understood in a better way, in a more community building way. So, and I thought, okay, it would be great if when we grade, when we assess courses, restorative justice courses, we also assess in what way this course contribute to build community. In what way, so not just assess concepts, well, but also how things were relationally, well, and that's it. That's what I liked. Thank you.
Jerry Johnstone?
Yeah, sorry. I'm the type, if I go to see a film, somebody asks me, what did you think of it? I'll tell them to come back, in 2 weeks, and I might know, be beginning to think about that. Yeah, so it takes me time to process a lot of this stuff, like, yeah, but I've just found it fascinating, sort of to hear about, I think, the range of ways in which, sort of educators are engaging with, I suppose, trying to mediate between institutions that have got one focus on the teaching of restorative justice, and just the creativity and the kind of range of ways in which people have solved that problem, like, or try to solve it and are thinking about it. I find fascinating, and I need now to watch this again, read through all my scribbled notes, and actually come to where I would conclude. Just one observation is, I suppose I'm always looking for what's missing, like, kind of, who's missing from this conversation, right? Which is quite an interesting kind of, it's quite interesting that there aren't any philosophers, so sort of, I don't know, yes, it's sort of, which is, well, nobody from politics, but given the philosophical richness of restorative justice as a concept, the fact that we haven't located people teaching it in philosophy departments is something that's worth thinking about.
Rowan? Rowan Sweeney, would you like to come in on that?
Hi, thanks so much. I've learned a lot from today. I've taken many notes. It's been great to hear from lots of different disciplines and also different ideas of how best to teach restorative justice or different activities that you can use. I think also what's come out for me is the idea of maybe restorative justice not fitting well within some institutions or maybe in some subject areas. And I think also as we've discussed, the importance of kind of active learning when it comes to restorative justice can really teach a lot to, you know, education and higher education quite generally, and how to promote critical thinking through active learning within different topics, whether it's criminology or restorative justice. So yes, lots of great discussion. Thank you.
And Wendy.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks so much to everyone for your contributions. It's been such a pleasure for me to sit and listen to the richness of your reflections. And one of the things that I'm really struck by is how interdisciplinary this really is, this group, the methods that you use in your teaching, the outcomes that you seek. So that's really been such a treat to listen to. And when I think about this in terms of what it is that I might personally take away for my work, for our work with Education for Justice, I think that there's more than I could say in just these few moments. But Brian had said, how do we build a more restorative society? And I think that this is at the heart of what the Education for Justice project is doing at the primary, secondary and tertiary levels, is values building among students so that they are better equipped to deal with the challenges, the rule of law challenges that the future will bring. And I think that one of the things that for me really comes through beautifully in everything that I've heard today is, I mean, it's interesting, Jerry just said there are no philosophers here, but what I'm kind of hearing is the philosophical questioning that is at the heart of restorative justice around what is justice? What is harm? How do we repair harm? Indeed, something as provocative as what is rehabilitation? And do our dominant concepts of rehabilitation work within a criminal justice framework? I mean, we could do another session just on that one question, right? But those philosophical questions open up for me this beautiful synergy with the core of our work, which is human rights, upholding human rights, shared human dignity, equal access to justice, victim participation, the right to be heard. All of those values for me really are enlivened by the questions, the strategies that you're using in the teaching that you do. And there I wanted to just bring one tiny further layer to what it is that I am saying, that you have all said so much more eloquently. And that is to pick up on something that Petra was saying just now in closing around teaching with restorative values. And I think that this maps beautifully onto what Ruta had said as well about the peaceful teacher. It seems to me that restorative justice has so much to offer higher education generally when we consider, you know, what is being taught, these values that are being taught, and the values with which they are being taught. I think that for Education for Justice, there's some work for us to do to mainstream some of this work across the modules that we have. And this can be part of our continuous improvement, starting with, of course, embedding this webinar in our restorative justice module so that academics around the world can listen to this and understand what restorative justice pedagogy can be in practice. And if we're thinking about credibility and sustainability for restorative justice into the future, please don't hesitate to share the link to the restorative justice module with your younger scholars, with, you know, your head of department. Share it with whomever you like. I think that, you know, really that would be brilliant, I think, for sustainability for this particular field. But I can't thank you enough for your time and your energy and your insights. And of course, thank you very much to Ian for the facilitation. Thanks.
Thanks, Wendy. And I'd just like to close the roundtable then by thanking you again, Wendy, and the UNODC and the Education for Justice Initiative for providing a platform for our conversation. If you haven't done so already, please check out the E4J website, where, as Wendy says, you can find a range of materials and resources to help you develop your criminology and criminal justice curricula. For those of you who are watching the recording of this session, if you found it useful, please let us know by emailing me on ian.marder@mu.ie, as I think we can organize more activities in this area if people find it to be of value. In the meantime, please do continue to connect with each other, as it's the only way for us to maintain strong relationships and communities throughout this crisis. Thank you so much to everyone here for participating today. I'm Ian Marder from Maynooth University in Ireland, and I wish you all the very best in your teaching and scholarship activities. Thank you all very much.